The Ukrainian Insurgent Army, usually known by its Ukrainian initials UPA, was one of the most controversial armed movements in 20th-century Eastern Europe. Founded in October 1942, it emerged in a region trapped between Nazi Germany, the Soviet Union, and competing national movements. To some Ukrainians, the UPA represents a desperate struggle for independence against overwhelming imperial powers. To many Poles, Jews, Soviet veterans, and critics, it is remembered for ethnic violence, extremist nationalism, and collaboration with Nazi Germany late in the war. Understanding the UPA requires holding these facts together, not choosing only one. It was both a guerrilla force fighting for a Ukrainian state and a movement linked to mass violence against civilians. Its story begins with the collapse of empires, the rise of radical nationalism, and the brutal conditions of World War II. The UPA grew out of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, known as the OUN. The OUN was founded with the goal of creating an independent Ukrainian state, at a time when many Ukrainians lived under Polish, Soviet, Romanian, or Czechoslovak rule. Its ideology was shaped by interwar radical nationalism. It saw the nation as the highest political value, accepted violence as a legitimate tool, and imagined independence coming through a national revolution. The article's source notes that the OUN envisioned this revolution being led by a dictatorship that would expel occupying powers and then establish a state claiming to represent Ukrainian society. This was not liberal democracy. It was an authoritarian nationalist project, born in a region where borders shifted violently and where competing states often treated minority populations with suspicion or repression. By the early 1940s, the OUN itself had split into rival factions. The faction associated with Stepan Bandera, often called the Banderites, played the central role in creating the UPA. On October 14, 1942, the Ukrainian Insurgent Army was founded as a partisan formation. Its purpose was to combine scattered armed groups into a more unified structure capable of fighting for Ukrainian independence. But the timing mattered. This was not a normal military birth in peacetime. The UPA was formed during Nazi occupation, after the Soviet retreat from western Ukraine, and before the Red Army's return. Civil authority had broken down. Weapons circulated widely. Local communities faced forced labor, executions, deportations, hunger, and partisan warfare. In this chaotic landscape, the UPA tried to build power by force. The UPA was not a conventional army with a stable front line. It operated as a guerrilla movement, especially in forests and rural areas of Volhynia, Polesia, and later other western Ukrainian regions. The source describes it as decentralized, divided into 3 operational regions, each adapting to local circumstances. That decentralization matters because the war around it constantly changed. One village might fear German police units, another Soviet partisans, another Polish underground forces, and another UPA detachments. Not all UPA fighters were committed OUN ideologues. Some joined for protection, coercion, survival, anti-Soviet sentiment, or nationalist conviction. But the organization's political leadership was tied to the OUN's vision, and the movement's actions were shaped by the wider struggle to control territory, loyalty, food supplies, and population movement. From February 1943, the UPA fought German forces in parts of Volhynia and Polesia. These clashes included attacks on German units, police posts, and supply lines, as well as attempts to seize weapons and equipment. However, the relationship between the UPA and Nazi Germany was complex and changed over time. The UPA opposed German occupation because Nazi rule denied Ukrainian sovereignty and exploited the population. At the same time, the movement's ideology contained ethnic exclusionary elements, and later in the war, as Germany retreated and the Soviet Union advanced, UPA leaders increasingly viewed the Soviets as the greater threat. By late July 1944, according to the source, the UPA formed a united front with Nazi Germany, stopping attacks on the withdrawing Wehrmacht and receiving military aid against the Soviets. The most morally devastating part of the UPA's history is its role in massacres of Polish civilians in Volhynia and eastern Galicia. In 1943 and 1944, UPA forces targeted Polish communities as part of a campaign to remove Poles from territories claimed for a future Ukrainian state. The violence included attacks on villages and civilians, not merely battles with armed opponents. Estimates vary, but the source cites up to 100,000 Polish civilian deaths. Poland officially recognizes these massacres as genocide. The UPA also fought the Polish Home Army, the main resistance force of the Polish underground state, but the killing of civilians cannot be reduced to normal combat. It was ethnic violence tied to competing national claims, wartime radicalization, revenge cycles, and an ideology willing to use terror against perceived enemies. Why did Polish-Ukrainian violence become so intense in these regions? Volhynia and eastern Galicia were ethnically mixed borderlands with overlapping historical claims. Before the war, many Ukrainians in interwar Poland felt politically marginalized and culturally restricted, while many Poles saw the region as part of their national homeland. When Nazi and Soviet occupations destroyed state institutions, underground groups tried to shape the post-war future by controlling facts on the ground. For the UPA, removing Polish civilians was seen as a way to prevent the restoration of Polish authority. For Polish armed groups, self-defense and retaliation became central. But the imbalance of suffering among civilians, especially Polish villagers in 1943, remains a core reason the UPA's legacy is so bitterly disputed. National liberation rhetoric cannot erase civilian massacre. As the Red Army pushed westward in 1944, the UPA shifted toward a long anti-Soviet insurgency. The Soviet Union had already ruled parts of western Ukraine from 1939 to 1941, bringing arrests, deportations, forced political transformation, and repression. Many Western Ukrainians feared a return of Soviet power. After the front passed, Soviet security forces, especially NKVD units, fought to destroy the UPA network. The conflict was not only military. It involved intelligence operations, informers, village surveillance, deportations of suspected supporters, and attempts to sever guerrillas from the civilian population. The UPA attacked Soviet officials, police, military targets, and local collaborators. The Soviets responded with overwhelming state power. This became a shadow war after World War II officially ended in Europe. The UPA's resistance continued longer than many people realize. The source states that organized armed resistance against Soviet forces lasted until 1949, when the movement was formally disbanded in early September. Yet some units and remnants continued operating into the 1950s. In Communist Poland, UPA units also tried to prevent the forced deportation of Ukrainians from Western Galicia to the Soviet Union until 1947. This was part of the violent remaking of post-war borders and populations, when entire communities were moved in the name of state security or ethnic consolidation. By the late 1940s, however, the UPA was increasingly isolated. Soviet and Polish communist authorities had stronger intelligence networks, better resources, and control over territory. Guerrilla survival became harder with each passing year. According to the source article, the last official military engagement associated with UPA remnants occurred in October 1956, near the Hungarian border region, in connection with support for the attempted Hungarian Revolution. By then, the UPA as a meaningful organized army had effectively ceased to exist. Its remaining fighters were fugitives, underground cells, or symbolic holdouts rather than a force capable of changing borders. Still, the long duration of the insurgency became an important part of later memory. Supporters emphasized that UPA fighters resisted both Nazi and Soviet domination and continued fighting after most of Europe had accepted the post-war order. Critics emphasized that this endurance did not cancel the movement's ideological extremism, anti-Polish violence, and episodes of cooperation with Nazi Germany. The legacy of the UPA is sharply divided because different communities remember different wounds. In parts of Ukraine, especially Western Ukraine, monuments, songs, memorials, and commemorations present the UPA as national freedom fighters who struggled for independence when no Ukrainian state existed. In 2019, surviving UPA members were officially granted veteran status by the government of Ukraine. For many Ukrainians living under the shadow of Soviet repression and later Russian pressure, anti-Soviet resistance has deep emotional power. But for many Poles, the central memory is not anti-Soviet struggle. It is the massacre of Polish civilians in Volhynia and eastern Galicia. For Soviet veterans and families targeted by the UPA, positive commemoration can feel like honoring those who killed their comrades or relatives. A responsible history of the Ukrainian Insurgent Army cannot be reduced to a slogan. The UPA was born from a real Ukrainian desire for statehood in a region dominated by larger powers. It fought Nazi Germany at times, fought the Soviet Union for years, and resisted communist control after World War II. But it also emerged from an authoritarian nationalist movement that accepted political violence, carried out massacres of Polish civilians, and eventually cooperated with Nazi Germany against the Soviets. Its history is therefore not a simple tale of heroes or villains, but a warning about what happens when national liberation, ethnic exclusion, occupation, and total war collide. Remembering the UPA honestly means recognizing both the struggle for independence and the victims left in its path. If you found this helpful, please like this video and subscribe for more explainers.